Okay. All right. So America is a drug culture, but it's a very strange one, full of curious and I would say dangerous contradictions. The psychotropic drugs that are perfectly legal in this country, with the exception of, say, age restrictions, are some of the most dangerous that we have to our health. Alcohol and tobacco are the obvious examples. And many of the psychotropic drugs that are illegal are now understood to be much, much safer to consume than the drugs you can buy in your neighborhood convenience store. For instance, there's never, literally never, been a death directly related to the chemical in marijuana or even LSD. Yet, consider this, that in the past couple of years, more people have been arrested in New York City for marijuana possession between 1978 and 1996 in 1 year. So we're just talking about, say, 2010 or 2011. This makes marijuana the #1 reason for arrests in one of the biggest cities in our country. Or consider that American colleges tend to have no tolerance policies towards marijuana. For instance, students caught with marijuana could lose their financial aid. But binge drinking is prevalent and culturally embedded, and underage drinking typically results in soft punishments at universities. So why do people take drugs? Well, to feel better, whatever that means. Alcohol and tobacco aside, there is another huge industry in the business of selling Americans drugs to feel better, but in the name of medicine, and sometimes under the guise of science, and this is the pharmaceutical industry. And consider this, about 15% of all American men are taking an antidepressant. About 1 in 4 women in the United States are taking an antidepressant. Anti-anxiety drug prescriptions are on the rise and are about just shy of 100 million annually. At the top selling drug from Eli Lilly, one of the country's biggest pharmaceutical companies, this is the one that came up with Prozac, is an antipsychotic medication, which makes them about $5 billion annually. Now, these are all medications that are prescribed for mental illnesses. You have to get that diagnosis to receive one through your doctor. But on the one hand, if so many of us are taking these medications, maybe we need to redefine the very notion of mental illness. Now, as it turns out, prescription psychotropic drugs are most certainly not safer than many illegal drugs. Antidepressants, for instance, have documented effects including nausea, headaches, to reduce blood clotting, which can lead to internal bleeding, to involuntary movements, twitches that can persist for the rest of your life, to, ironically and sadly, even increased likelihood of suicide. At the same time, recent analyses of all the available clinical trial data for antidepressants suggest that, on the whole, these multi-billion-dollar drugs don't really work that much better than placebos or sugar pills. So let's leave aside alcohol and tobacco, and we're left with this sort of annoying contradiction, one that goes to the heart of, I think, basic social and political tensions in this country. On the one hand, you can go to jail for possessing an herb that you can grow in your backyard and which is seemingly safe. On the other hand, there's an excellent chance that you or somebody you know is taking a prescription psychotropic drug, which may or may not work, how we define that, and whose health risks are demonstrably worse than those of, say, marijuana or LSD or psilocybin, which is the active chemical in so-called magic mushrooms. So I would say, in the context of today's event, that this is a massive form of social, political, and cultural exclusion. Now, I studied to become something of an anthropologist. I'm particularly interested in exploring our cultural relationships to drugs, how we learn about them, experience them, how we make personal and social meanings from them. And appropriate to the theme of our gathering tonight, I was especially interested in how people have come to use cultural resources, especially social media like YouTube, to resist or challenge or transform scientific and medical ideas about drugs, pharmaceutical companies, and mental illnesses. And so I wanted to use use the rest of this time to share some specific examples with you. The United States is a really interesting cultural landscape for psychopharmaceuticals because other than New Zealand, we are the only country in the world that allows drug companies to advertise directly to consumers. I can guarantee that most of you have seen a drug ad, whether online or on TV or in a magazine. And pharmaceutical companies have very culturally specific notions of how your true self is best understood as a scientific or medical object. I think this is a distinctly American phenomenon. And so, of course, what are advertisements? Well, they're enticements to get you to buy something. Over time, this has gone far beyond simple explanations of what a product is and why you might find it useful. Nowadays, advertisements encourage you to think of products not necessarily just functional or useful, but as crucial to who you are as a person, to your identity, to what it means to be you, your true self. Now this is as true for antidepressants as it is for cars or clothing. Okay, so here's the example that I want to spend the rest of my time on. And speaking of time, I've already lost track of it, so Sienna, you can
you're good.
call on me when you need to. So who has seen this image that I have up here? All right, like a bunch. It's from an advertisement for the antidepressant Zoloft, which Pfizer made, and it ran in a television and magazine advertising campaign between 2001 and 2006. Now the campaign ended in 2006 because that's when Pfizer's patent on Zoloft ran out, but this whole notion of the chemical imbalance has stayed with us and has since taken on a cultural life of its own. The original advertisement, for instance, has stayed alive on YouTube, and what's interesting to me, sort of ethologically, ethnographically, is that viewers, rather than being just a passive television audience, have used social media like YouTube to produce their own parodies or remixes of these kinds of ads. And so, Sienna, if you go to the next one, this is a still from a parody called Zolift, and there's a voiceover here that says, this is a diagram of cells bouncing off of brain nerves. Your brain is very complicated, so we won't try to explain anything here. So, I mean, I love this because, you know, what the person who made this ad might not know is that this actually reveals a deep controversy both within the scientific and psychiatric communities over what exactly we mean by a chemical imbalance. Is it real? Can it be measured? Does it actually correlate with the thing that we call depression and whose symptoms we measure by checklists and not by blood draws? And it turns out that proving that somebody has a chemical imbalance is extraordinarily difficult, very controversial. Pfizer had actually been sued by a patient advocacy group over the very notion of the chemical imbalance. And it was never really resolved. It just sort of went away because the ad went away because the patent on the drug expired. And that's great. But again, culturally, it persists. But it doesn't just persist, hegemonically as a narrative that everybody has to swallow. It persists in a way that nowadays people can transform it and challenge it, in their own ways, which often involves humor, which is great. Okay, so we go to the next slide. Again, Harry would say that, so this, right. So some of these YouTube parodies have reinvigorated historical tensions between these strictly biomedical approaches that privilege drug therapy and brain-based conceptions of depression, and psychodynamic approaches that privilege talk therapy and interpersonal conflict-based explanations of the same. So this spoof reimagined the Zoloft campaign as if it were targeted at Shakespeare's paramount tragic figure Hamlet. The tagline here is, while the cause is unknown, depression may be due to a backstabbing family member. In the interest of time, I'll shorten the analysis and just kind of keep up with the examples. So, I think there was one before that, but I'll skip to this one.
That one?
No?
That one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's fascinating that in advertisements for pharmaceuticals, which is so prevalent, you never actually see people taking them. You don't see people consuming these drugs, which is a fascinating contrast to other commodities that are advertised and are shown to be pleasurable: cars, clothing, food. The pharmaceutical industry really goes out of its way to make sure that these products are not advertised as pleasurable. because that transgresses a line between proper medicine and pleasure, or something that is no longer properly scientific, properly within the bounds of psychiatry, and so on. But of course, historically, people taking antidepressants precisely that way. Valium was one of the most prescribed drugs in history, starting in the 60s through the 80s, primarily because people really enjoyed taking them. They were fun. And so, but afterwards, with the later generation of antidepressants, pharmaceutical companies really went out of their way to make sure that they were not perceived as pleasurable or mind-altering. They were supposed to be restorative, to get you back to a normative state of health or personality. But again, you have people taking these parodies and saying, well, that's not always the case. Okay, if you go back to the
this one?
One before that.
That guy.
Yeah, so this was actually from a Mad TV, I don't know if any of you guys remember that show, parody of the Zoloft commercial. And basically it was supposed to be using the same imagery and logic of the Zoloft commercial to talk about, well, what if instead of selling Zoloft, they were selling ecstasy? And so the programs are anthropomorphized, but again, the logic transfers that people do take ecstasy for precisely the same reason that people take Zoloft, they're not advertised. But the parody persists on YouTube. And if you go to the next one, this is the sort of analogous set of slides from the original ad, just to compare to that. And then lastly, I know I'm out of time here.
We have one more.
Yeah, I really like this one just because, again, the sort of return to self, return to health in Zoloft is presented as a matter of neurochemical activity rather than subjective experience. It's not you as a person who consumes the drugs, it's your brain, and it's sort of taken out of your bodily and psychological context. But I love this because in this parody, somebody is not consuming the drug, they're consuming the ad about the drug, and that's making them happy, which actually connects with the whole idea of the placebo effect. If you have an expectation about the drug, then it transforms your experience of it. Believe it or not, pharmaceutical advertisers are now thinking about these ads as bolstering the placebo effect. If you see the ad, you'll have a greater expectation about what the drug can do to you. You take the drug, you have a better experience on it, and therefore it's more efficacious, which measurably, therefore, is seen to be a better treatment for depression. So you see how this crazy postmodern cycle of our relationship to drugs, to media, to industry, to power, to our bodies, it's all we're in a really wild place with this. And so just anthropologically, I love to take these stupid little videos deadly seriously to see what sort of interesting issues we can generate, in our contemporary power structures like the pharmaceutical industry. Great, thank you.